A child laughs as her parents push her on a swing. A teenager walks by as his golden retriever drags him along. A small group of friends kicks a soccer ball back and forth, while another nearby group enjoys a picnic. These timeless scenes are happening as we speak, all across America, specifically in our public parks. On the surface, we naturally observe these fun-filled scenes, but as more visitors enter the park area, they spot metal monuments of past Americans, of Christopher Columbus or Robert E. Lee. These monuments and statues represent history, but Americans have debated for decades how dated and controversial aspects of American history should mesh with the modern world. Statues are set in stone, but our values are not. How do we, as a country and a community, present troublesome or unpopular aspects of American history, while still representing and respecting the values of modern-day society? And to what degree are present-day citizens held responsible to incorporate history into everyday life? The debate over whether to keep or remove controversial monuments resurfaced during the summer of 2015, when terrorist Dylan Roof killed 9 black parishioners worshiping in a South Carolina church, hoping to spark a race war. Americans took note of the photos of Roof bearing that Confederate flag. This symbol to some embodies Southern pride, while others view it as a racist call to action. Since South Carolina has a Confederate flag raised above its Capitol building, protests erupted over taking down the Confederate flag, then the Confederate statues too. Finally, the controversy expands to local communities across the nation, where all types of controversial figures are represented. A national conversation began regarding the status of these statues and monuments, and whether they were reflective of modern values. Our team of Penn State University students took to the streets to investigate how everyday citizens feel about the controversial statues in their hometowns. Do their views conflict or agree with what the statues symbolize in their respective opinions? America has mixed opinions about where to draw the line between recording history and respecting present-day citizens. What makes drawing this line difficult is that past figures in American history aren't 100% moral or immoral. The line that separates the good people from the bad ones is blurred and dynamic because as views change over time, so do our opinions about our monuments. So what may seem socially acceptable one day may be ghastly the next. The question of how statues and monuments represent or disrespect current beliefs even expand to more mobile artifacts like paintings and portraits. President Trump recently resurrected a painting of Andrew Jackson and insulted Native American veterans in front of that portrait of a man who killed many Native Americans and drove them out of hometowns over the course of his career. Artifacts and monuments bring on different meanings under different circumstances. What may appear as remembering America's past can become offensive when words or actions become associated with the objects. But how do Americans decide what is acceptable and what isn't? Statues are set in stone, but values aren't. It's up to Americans to decide if these values what you wrote over time or remain preserved, despite the external forces acting upon them.
To some, the flag is a symbol of Southern pride, while others view it as a racist call to action. Since South Carolina had a Confederate flag raised above its Capitol building, protests erupted over taking down the Confederate flag, then the Confederate statues. As the conversation about these monuments and their connection to white supremacy grew, the discussion spread to other monuments, perhaps most prominently in the form of Christopher Columbus. Although Columbus is credited with discovering the New World, he also had a history of mistreating Native Americans. He enslaved them, mutilated them for even minor offenses, and finally exterminated the Taino people of the Caribbean. By the time he died in the 1500s, many Europeans did not respect him as an honorable explorer, but rather as a man with a dark, tarnished image. And yet, as America developed its independent identity, it latched onto the ideal of Columbus, putting his name on music, statues, and even cities, including our very own capital district, Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. Today, far from being seen as an idealistic explorer he's portrayed as in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th century, controversy surrounds Columbus. Some claim he was a hero, others a genocidal villain. Calls for statue removals have expanded to the Columbus statues, with many activists taking matters into their own hands. One went so far as to film himself in the act of destruction while explaining the reasoning and rationale behind his decision. There is a genuine historical debate surrounding Columbus and his misdeeds, leading some to ask, where does it stop?
Frank Rizzo is a controversial and pretty corrupt mayor from Philadelphia's past. And even though he's widely disliked today, there's still a statue of him up here in front of the Municipal Services Building. Many people thought it should be taken down, and recently, about a month ago, the city said, yeah, take it down, why not? Because many people go even farther than saying he's corrupt. They think he's a racist, and he's very unpopular with the modern citizens of Philadelphia.
From chatting with my dad on the way to Philly, I found out that although Mayor Rizzo had used more heavy-handed policing, widely considered to be unfair against the black and Latino communities of Philly, he did successfully decrease crime and make the city a safer place for those who lived there. Our first interview was a young Temple student studying political science. His response to our questions was particularly well put and most likely representative of how the majority of young Americans feel on this issue.
Do you know who this statue is of?
Yes, that's former Mayor Frank Rizzo.
So how do you think having these statues still up reflects on our values today?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, there's lots of backlash from communities that are very angered by what he stood for and the sort of things he did in the city of Philadelphia. And then there's a lot of communities that also value the efforts that he brought to the office of the mayor, and they sort of respected his leadership. If we don't reflect on the bad things, we can't learn from them, we can't prevent them from happening again. I think statues of controversial figures like this are better off in a museum.
We also interviewed a man who spoke positively of Rizzo and his effect on Philadelphia and lamented the statue's departure from city center.
So, how do you think having statues of controversial people like Frank Rizzo reflects on our values today?
Statues are commemorative of the people that formed services in history.
Do you agree with them taking it down and moving it to a museum?
That's the first I heard of that. I didn't know that they were going to put it in a museum.
I'm not exactly sure where they're putting it, but I don't think it's going into like a dump or anything.
Well, it shouldn't go into a dump, and I find it ridiculous that, people are getting upset over a statue for somebody who did something good for the city of Philadelphia. There were people in the city of Philadelphia who said that at least when Rizzo was in as the mayor, they didn't have to live with bars across their windows.
Yeah.
We also interviewed a woman who discussed her memories of how Frank Rizzo socially contributed to the oppression of minorities during the 20th century.
So, do you know who the statue is of?
This is the Frank Rizzo statue.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little girl. I remember Frank Rizzo. He was a police officer at one time and became a mayor of the city of Philadelphia.
How do you think having statues of controversial people like this reflects on our values today?
I think, to be honest, we have a very racist system in America, not only in the state, but the city of Philadelphia.
She goes on to describe how Frank Rizzo used his position as mayor to contribute to racism against black people in Philadelphia when she was a child.
So, do you agree with the statue coming down and moving somewhere else?
I really think the city of Philadelphia should not invest money in moving this statue because there's a lot of controversial other statues that need to go also. And here, all these years later, I think our Mayor Kenny has really done a positive thing by placing the statue of Octavius Cato on the other side. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
Oh, please take a look to that. That's very, very important. He was an African-American man, a brilliant man who was killed on South Street.
After asking Philadelphians how they felt, the more typical answers, along the lines of, "I agree that we should be reevaluating our values, move the statue to a museum," were common among younger people who weren't actually around for Rizzo's tenure. The more nuanced answers we found were from folks who lived in the city while Frank Rizzo was mayor. It seems, at least from my experience, that everyone believes it's important to consider carefully who we publicly celebrate based on our current values. But there are still lingering disagreements over the actual legacy of those who were celebrating. The city of Philadelphia, by removing the statue, seems to be fundamentally changing the way they address the past.
Johnny comes marching home, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Get ready for the Jubilee, hurrah, hurrah! We'll give the hero 3 times 3, hurrah, hurrah! Oh, the laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his loyal brow, and we'll all